Namaste. So, basically, just as we have as an individual a body, a life force, a mind self, and a soul, that is exactly the same way that we have a body of a nation, which we know as the country, then its psychological self, its mental self, and its spiritual self or the soul. But how it is formed before that, I think that has already been touched a little bit, but I'll like to bring in it in a slightly different way. Ordinarily, we feel that the body forms first and the soul comes later. But in the original plan, it is not exactly this way, but the nation's souls are there, and the physical body is shaped through various kinds of physical forces. And if we look at the entire earth itself, if we regard her as the vision, with the vision of a mother earth as she is called in the Puranas, so we begin to see that different continents, they have come into aspects, and even subsequent to that, the countries, they represent something or the other, some aspect of the divine being as earth. Now, this image is very interesting because I keep referring to this image very often in different ways. This image of the Purusha, or if you want to call it Shakti, the divine mother, and from different aspects of her, different forces, energies, beings, godheads have emerged and they have gone into creation, and man is created in that image. Something very similar happens with earth. And if we look at the earth from one perspective, we'll see that a previous phase of evolution which took place somewhere, maybe, who knows, the Arctic areas, and still further up, the intellectual aspects, and then we see the material aspect and the psychological aspects, emotional and other states, the vital aspects, and of course the spiritual aspects. So the countries and continents, they represent something of, each of them represents predominantly something of that. Now this is first to understand that, then the soul aspect comes into play. For instance, if we look at the entire journey, if you look at America, for instance, we see very clearly that what is prominent is in America, what is predominant is America, is a very, the working on matter, a solid aspect of matter, material existence, which is very strong and prominent. And when Swami Vivekananda mentioned passingly, and something very similar Sri Aurobindo and the mother have said, when people wanted to send, you know, thought forms and even people to India to teach them about spirituality, then Swami Vivekananda said a little more bluntly, he said, well, spirituality we'll give to you. We need the money and give the money. So essentially, if we look at the America with the abundance of riches and economy, so very clearly the land is deeply rooted in matter. What we would, if we take the hierarchy of being, we will call it as the Muladhar. Now, this is an important aspect of creation. It is that's why America does have a strong impact upon the world play and the world forces, simply because it is where the rootedness lies, rootedness of matter. So it's very important. It represents that. But if you come to Europe, it's more, it takes on a different hue altogether. So it's primarily vital with emotional, aesthetic, even an intellectual culture. If you look at Greece, if you look at France, now it doesn't mean that other places not there, but predominantly, if you see ancient Greece, if you see ancient, even modern France for that matter, and many of these countries, intellectual, subtle, aesthetic, emotional, the sense of inner beauty which tends to express itself in various forms, we see predominantly that taking place in Europe. If we go down to Africa, then we see in Africa the largely subconscious and largely a subconscious forces, and if that can be tapped, and that's why this maybe in the in the future that is going to unfold before us, more and more attention will be turned towards it, because therein there is the another kind of energies which are lying hidden, lying in the depths, in the darkened state, and yet when they emerge, they are going to have a strong impact upon life. If we turn to Asia, Asiatic cultures are largely intellectual. So we have that cycle which is complete, going from America, where there is rootedness in physical matter, entering into Europe, where we see above the matter these chakras which come in the the strong ambition, the emotional aspects, the kind of aesthetic aspects. And then we come to Asia, where there is more intellectual culture right from the beginning. And among them, India specifically, we see it represents the deeper heart, like the soul of the world. So, this is how we can picturize Mother Earth, with the upper Arctic and the lower Antarctic as the two poles between which all creation moves. So, when we look at this whole earth in this way, then we can see her as one single body of the mother, where each nation brings it something very unique and something very specific for the as part of the world yagna. So this is one part of it. Then secondly, we see that uh, this formation of a nature's soul, of a nation's soul, is there much before that actually the body is formed in certain ways. So physical body is important. Shobindo says that the country, the way geography forms it, because behind the forces of nature, the driving element is always a greater consciousness, a deeper consciousness. So I take this example of India, that when we look at India geographically, because that's what I'm most conversant with, but even with some of these other countries, we see very beautifully that India breaks off from Africa and joins with Asia, and thereby it becomes a kind of bridge between these two. And when it joins, there is the springing of the Himalayas. Even when we look at the physical form, so India is almost like a, one can picturize a little goddess. Shobindu spoke of her as Devi, and it contains. It is like a heart. It's like the deeper heart of the whole world. One can see there. But the formation of India as a spiritual entity came much before the physical entity. And the physical entity grew naturally around that. So, what is this spiritual aspect through which India came into existence? And something like that I feel has gone into other countries also. When I look at, for instance, the formation of France and the Gauls, or the Celtic races, or if you look at the America and the Mayas and Mayan civilization, and then subsequently, much later, the visions of Washington D.C., the more modern founder of America. So when we go to a culture, or when we look at Egypt, more subconscious. So many of these occult powers, occult forces, which were part of the African. Continent, specifically the Egyptian, going down. It was famous for that. And when we look at India, the way it was formed was in a very deeply spiritual way. So it was woven through stories, and very spiritually through the story of the legend of Sati. And I think I mentioned this, that when Sati is the old part of the old creation, she is the divine mother, but assuming a certain body, and she wants to join Shiva and get married with him. She gets married, but they cannot live always happily ever after, because Shiva is all about freedom and Prajapati is all about rules and regulations. And I feel this is one of the challenges that at least India is set to resolve, the problem between individual freedom and the collective life, which every country faces in a way. But in many of the nations, it is resolved by the rule of the law. But the rule of the law is only a very temporary makeshift arrangement. In the Indian context, it has to be the rule of dharma, which takes care of both. So the body parts of Sati, which fall all over India, if you really look at it, forms actually the map of India in a very spiritual way. So, and then the various yagyas, the various saints, sages, seers. If you look at the cultural unity which came first, much before the national unity took place. So, what I'm trying to say is that it's the soul that drives the impulse towards the rest of the nation formation. So, if you look at India, how it formed, so if one wants to understand Kashmir to Kanyakumari is all about Shiva, the legend of Shiva in Kashmir, Himalaya, which is his abode, Kailash, and Kanyakumari. Even there are legends. I'm resisting the temptation to go into all these stories where Shiva must come and join Kanyakumari. And in their union, of course, there is bliss, but there is a particular asura who has to be killed, which is only possible if the union does not take place. Very fascinating tale. And if you look at India from the west to the east, is all about Krishna. So you see Dwarka and you see Manipur. So it's like Krishna, between Krishna and Shiva. You form a very interesting. The way this is how the nation was formed, and the names kept changing. Rama travels all the way up, down south, right up to Sri Lanka. So there was a vision of this undivided India or Akhand Bharat, which was done by the rishis because of a very particular kind of special work that was to be done in India, and that was the yagya for the spiritual evolution and spiritual emancipation of mankind. But at the same time, each country has its own deeper spiritual cry, and it must find ways and means to express itself. For instance, as I said, in America, it is things must get crystallized at the level of matter. That's why if you speak about Vedanta just as a philosophical thing, it will be very difficult to absorb it. But if you give a technique or a method, that immediately shows actual change. That's how the transcendental meditation and many of these methods became very well known, because they showed at the level of physical body there is a change. So they got very easily absorbed into the American system. Whereas in India, the reverse is true. Surrender, faith, all these things come very naturally. It doesn't matter how they impact your physical body. That is it's a much later movement of time that these things come. Whereas if you look at the European part, this aesthetic aspect and the more intellectual aspects, subtle kind of intellect, that is what is accepted first. France, for instance, gave this whole idea of, as we know, even in modern times, freedom, equality, and fraternity. So each nation has its own deeper cry. The Japan gifted this idea of the state or the larger unit being greater than the individual. The individual could immolate himself at the altar of the larger unit, which was a unity. So this idea of self-sacrifice through which the nation grows, this is there in Japan, and of course there is abundance of vital beauty. So one can see even in the way the physical nature tends to be composed. Now, once again, if I see India, there is something very interesting about India, that every possible weather, every possible mountain, deserts, ocean, beaches, everything is represented there. Dense forests, cityscapes, and you have a very complex plethora of humanity, because India is a complex nation which has formed over years, and with an awakened soul, it's meant to resolve many of the problems that vex humanity, but they can only be resolved on a deeper spiritual basis. So now if we look at this world, we see it like a Yagya-vedi, a Vishwa Yagya which is going on, in which each nation must bring its own offering and offer it into this yagna to be purified. And as it gets purified, it becomes integrated with the larger world consciousness. And this is the process which is going on. Why nation unit is important? Because very often nowadays we say nation is really not important. It doesn't matter because we are living in a larger international sentiment. But we must understand that nation is a step towards that. And if we blur this unit, then the unity will tend to take the rather primitive forms of empires, where one particular nation, one particular ideology tends to overrun everywhere else. So nation is the first unit where we are really trained into heterogeneity of human beings. There are different kind of diverse human beings and diverse cultures, different languages. In India, it's very India is like a miniature Aurobindo if you look at it from one point of view. So there are very different kinds of human beings, and yet you have to learn to live, find ways and means, which we are not allowed any kind of suppression of things by the rule of law, but a deeper psychic law with which we have to discover the source of human unity. So, in every nation, something like this happens. So, nation unit is the first unit where we need to learn the lesson of unity before we can go towards international unity. Otherwise, if we try to go towards international unity, one particular prominent ideology or way of life will tend to overrun all others. And the divine wants unity in diversity and not unity of sameness. And this is what nations have been trying to experiment, cultures have been trying to experiment. Root races, if you look at the root races, they again represent all the seven chakras, and they are all trying to, in one way or the other, experiment with this idea. Nation is the first unit where we experiment with the idea of the unit, which is the individual, and the many or the society. This is the first unit, and each nation tries to find its own way before it can build into a larger complex unity. So, for example, there are nations which are oriented too much towards individuality, but that individuality is largely the individual freedom of the desired self or the ego self. Do what you like, it's your life. But the larger unit is run by the rule of the law. So basically, reason comes and organizes the balance between the individual and the society. Every nation tries to do it. Whereas if we take the more communist way of life or the socialistic way, the way it is understood, I'm not talking of true commune and true socialism. So there it is, society is more important. Largely Asiatic societies at one time were there, where the society is more important than the individual, and the individual has to immolate himself at the altar of society. Then comes a different kind of a brotherhood which is largely religious, and therein the individual has to follow the norms of a religion. He should be more and more conforming to a pattern of uniformity with the rest of the group. Now this is how nations have been trying to adapt to this plan of unity in diversity, because this is the original plan, and the first lesson of that one learns is in a family. In a family, though it is homogeneous, yet there is this challenge of the individual and the family members who have their own way of life. Some follow that extreme step of breaking away, others follow the way of conforming to the larger family norms. But the real challenge is to find the way that an individual gains from the collectivity and the collectivity is enriched by the individual. So the same problem will come with the nation in its formation, that each nation must bring in its best to the world, and the world forces must in their own way replenish the impoverished parts of every nation. And that's why when we come back to what Swami Vivekananda said, and with regard to America and India, the mother said, and Sri Aurobindo said, that India is the spiritual guru of the world. What India can give is the wisdom, and it must do so. So if we look at India's destiny right from the days of Buddha and subsequently, India has been sending that kind of wisdom to the world at large. And other nation, each one brings his own asset. As I said, some bring abundance of material nature, some bring a kind of an aesthetic culture, and all this kind of acculturation process of mixing and assimilation is taking place. Just as in the case of formation of an individual and individuality, nation units are formed also through these three stages. First, the individuality is very nascent. So there is a kind of free mixing, free interchange. People are moving. If you go back to early stages of humanity when there is no nation unit, and people are moving through large spaces of land, they settle down, and then the next step comes where there is a kind of a thought, culture, a way of life which begins to develop in a certain group of mankind. So basically it's a group of mankind living in a particular geographical space, and they develop their own culture, their own thoughts, their own feelings, their way of life, their own philosophy. Sri Aurobindo gives that example, for instance, of Germany. So we see in Germany two things which are so prominent. One is the philosophical side. If you look at the German spirit, and the second is, of course, we know pure music, Beethoven, Wagner, and so in Germany these two things were very prominent. And each of the nation now, over a period of evolution, I mean, initially the nation units were very vague. They are there, they are pressing for manifestation. So all the upheavals that happen are because of that. Now, one of the places which is very strange in terms of nation formation, which has vexed me, and I'm sure it vexes others, is the land of Arabia. If you look at the land of Arabia, actually there is nothing really like a nation unit. So it is something very diffuse. So people have been coming from here, there, and everywhere, and people going here, there, and everywhere. So this urge for expansion and taking every boundary into its own. It's almost like a child who wants to grab every toy and make his own. So this kind of a diffusion is taking place, has taken place right from the beginning with regard to the Arabian Peninsula. Even in its formation, if you look at back at the geography and the formation of the Arabian Peninsula, it was like that. How people came from different places and they went to different places. Another, of course, fascinating thing is about China. And nobody really knows, and sometimes even in the script one can see. So there are scripts which run from right to left, some from left to right, and there are scripts which move vertically. Like in Chinese, we have these ideographs, symbols, and that is related to the movements of humanity. And as they saw the sun moving around, so in the early stages, this is how nation units were being formed. Then the second part of the formation is like when an individual is being formed, largely shaped by inner forces of which he is not really aware, but he has not really come into conflict with the other people at large, but there are things which are stirring inside. Like when we are entering into adolescence, we have our own thoughts, our own feelings. We don't know whether they are valid or invalid, and we have parents and we know their thoughts and feelings which may be very different. Then a time comes when nations begin to come into conflict with other nations. So this is a phase of formation of individuality, and that takes place through large spaces of time. So we have these empires which are being built, and through these empires, the contact takes place, and essentially all these empires are ways and means by which the individuality of a nation is being formed. It is trying to search for its soul. That process, largely the first part, where it tries to search for the soul through the ego self, because there are two ways we have to search for the soul. One is the false subjectivism, and the second is the true subjectivism. So we see these three levels at which nature forms. First is when people hold on to the land and they say the country is what belongs to me, and they are not interested in the culture, thought, music, poetry, and art, but they stand for the country. That's the root of patriotism. So people stand, they will defend their country, and it is the land for which they live. But then when humanity begins to awaken, there is another thing it becomes aware of, is the psychological aspect of a particular unit. And then they become aware of the thoughts, the feelings, the culture, the ways of life, and there is a kind of nationalism which begins to develop. So this is the next stage of nation building. It's happening now. I think most of the nations are now beginning to discover that, entering into kind of nationalism where they are trying to discover who they really are. So first step of nation units as a physical geographical entity is largely, there are some free floating places, but largely it has been established. And the last attempt of the Asura to demolish it was, of course, the Second World War. Now, there are nations which are still in the process. There are parts which have not been reclaimed, which are part of the larger unit of each nation. So, as we are aware in the Indian context, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Myanmar and Lanka, they are part of one single unit. And so they will be tussle, clash, conflict till they ultimately become one unit. Because that is how the national soul will keep driving. There are other countries also where this issue is taking place, where nations are yet to form. Sometimes when the land mass is very big, it's a big challenge. For instance, in Russia, when the land mass is too big, you can't just form a nation. So there were several different places which came together. So wherever land masses are very big, there is a tendency to have these very different provinces which come together. Russia, it's especially challenging. So on one side, there are now different political systems. On the other side, there is a common cultural base. It's a different kind of an experiment which is taking place in the Russian and the Ukrainian conflict. Because if you go back to the roots, both come from the Slav community. There was a time when in the larger Russia, the capital was in Kiev. So if you really look at it this way, the conflict is at the deeper level. It's between uh, the cultural aspects of Ukraine. Where does it really belong to? Does it belong to this side of, shall I say, to the Asiatic side, or does it belong to the European side? That's where the conflict is. NATO and other things come up later on, but what will come out is a different story altogether. But it is still in the process of formation. So, in during that phase when nations are discovering themselves, there are conflicts, there are wars. As Aurobindo says, "Man die so that man may live and God be born." So, this is the process which is taking place, and during this phase, people begin to identify nation self with. With their thought structures, with their culture, with their feelings. For instance, in India, there is a very strong movement towards resurgence of who we are. Now, I don't much talk about religious and secular because I feel they are both standing at the level of ignorance, because the deeper level is spirit. When we talk about soul, then we are actually speaking of the spiritual aspects of religion, and this spirituality takes secular and religious aspect. In some places it takes a more religious view, whereas in other places it takes a secular view. But essentially the spirit tends towards unity. The common aspect of spirit is unity. Now when you try a religious unity or secular unity, both will fail, because both are attempts in ignorance. It may succeed for some time, but both will fail. So you have to discover the larger spiritual impulse in a nation. And in India, this is the second phase where we see it, like many of the nations are reborn. For instance, Gauls, France in a way started rediscovering itself. The Mayan civilization, not Red Indians, began to rediscover itself when certain people went and inhabited, and they had adopted a different way of life. Many places in Europe, the Greeks, the Roman Empire, so they went through all this tussle. There was a time when the Gauls were so much identified with the Roman empires, they became part of that. And then they freed themselves and they are rediscovering French as a people. England, for instance, there was a whole time when England represented the soul of Europe. But in England itself, we see the Irish and the Welsh and Irish, they are trying to discover themselves. They are so different from the people which are, uh, part of England. So all these are processes which are taking place. They are trying to discover the nation unit at second level, and that second level is where we discover the cultural and not just the political, but cultural and emotive and the cognitive structures which have stood behind a nation. Now, in India, it is very evident that throughout the process, we see that essentially it is a spiritual thought. It has taken a variety of shapes and hues. It is essentially a spiritual thought that has been the governing aspect of the Indian nation. So it always stands behind and tends to reassert and rediscover itself. And then when this has happened, this is a process not yet complete. So we are, you see why this topic is difficult, because we are still in the process of formation. We still understand largely a nation as only a physical body. We don't understand that it has a subjective body which is real and living. In fact, more real and living than the physical body. So when people begin to discover and identify with that, then nationalism is born. They don't live only for the physical body. They live for the sake of the thoughts, ideologies, the cultural aspects of a particular nation, and they want to preserve this because it's the balustrade, the stronghold through which they will climb and discover the soul. As to the discovery of the soul of a nation, I think it's still quite some time away. It's rather premature. There have been attempts to discover it, like in France during the French Revolution, or in India. 1905 was a period when many countries were trying to rediscover their soul. Now, once again, that same process is happening because the evolution of a nation's soul, its discovery takes place through very large spaces of time. But nevertheless, it is not just important, it is indispensable to discover it. And that's why in Aurobindo, Mother had a pavilion for every nation. Because until we discover the national soul, we cannot talk about human unity. All this talk about human unity and suddenly, democratizing a whole mass of mankind through that process is all premature. It will collapse. That's what we are trying to, because Again, it's one way of asserting life. For instance, in India, they were kings, whereas in there was a democracy which ran parallel in a different way. There was socialism also, but it had a different basis altogether. Whereas we see the more of modern Europe and Greece and Athens and many other these places where democracy was prominent. Now you can't hold this single way over all the countries in all the world. That's not how it will be. It cannot be like that. Each country must discover its own unique way of life, its own unique system. For example, with regard to India, Mother said something very interesting. She said that India is the only country where the psychic law can and must become prominent. It must govern the nation. Now, what really is the psychic law? It is dharma. If you go back to the Indian context, what was the rule of the land? The rule of the land is not just a Raja, suddenly some edicts, some way of living he gave do's and don'ts and punished by law. This was not the way. It was dharma which was prominent. So things were seen through the balance of dharma. This was the Indian way of life. And it should be brought out. It cannot follow the rules of another civilizational process which are valid. It's not that one has to have one way of life. That is equally valid. But this must discover its own way. For instance, Shobindo spoke about the parliamentary system of democracy which is destined to fail. In the Indian context, especially, he cautioned about it. One can see that it is not working out. It's destined to fail. He even saw how democracy is. There is a whole vision of the mother where she sees Shobindo playing with a very old, worn out ball. And Shobindo says to her that I want another one. Get me a new one. And she says that ball is democracy. It has outlived its purpose. Dictatorship has outlived its purpose equally. So, what is going to really come? What will come is ultimately the way originally the divine governs. There is, we can use the word oligarchy. In Russia, we had oligarchy. And now we see that the oligarchs are all suddenly, it is the oligarchs which are bearing the brunt of the Russia-Ukraine war. So, all of them are going to come into in a very new way. So there is one person who is like a king, and then there are more like a presidential system. That way, the American system, in a certain sense, is more aligned with the deeper truth of things. But this is how each nation must solve the problem of unity in their own unique way. It cannot be just one way. And depending on how they solve it, they will come to the world and bring something of that there. So this is why we see in Aurobindo different nations each bringing their own understanding about life, their own way of life, and offering it as plausible solutions or plausible way. For instance, you see the recent conflict in Aurobindo. If you ask most of the Indian-based people, so they will say, if Mother has said her word is final, we should just follow that. Why? Because from the dharmic point of view, that is the way of life. That what the Guru says, that is the dharma that the disciples must adopt. But if you look at it from another side of the globe, so it's no, we must democratically decide what should happen, because ultimately it is everybody's consensus, which is very difficult if we try to do that process. So humanity is going through all this churning, and through all this churning, ultimately each nation will become discover its own way of resolving the problem of the individual and the society. This is the big challenge. And this is the first experiment. When it happens, when the nation unit is established, then we can enter into a larger sense of internationalism. Before that, we will make premature attempts. We had the UNO, for instance. We had rather League of Nations, then UNO. But we know that unless nations are grounded in their soul, as long as they are living in a false sense of subjectivism or the strong national ego, it won't work out. Yet there are steps which humanity takes. They will collapse and new ways of orienting will come. So because nations have to discover their soul, we see that now there is a wave of nationalism, because this is a second step. You can't realize human unity without that. So all nations, there is a strong turn towards nationalism, toward discovering who they are, and hopefully we are chastened by the experience of the world or the last few centuries that, well, this nation's soul is not the vital ego. That's what happened with Germany. It was trying to discover its national soul but ended up discovering a national ego. So there was the very kind of almost a pride that, we are someone very special, and, of course, we know the diabolic nature of what happened. But basically, it was trying to discover its soul, and suddenly everything was derailed. That beautiful music and beautiful, philosophy, all of them, everything was stalled. And instead, what it discovered was a vital ego. The Asura and Rakshasa, it is the danger which meets every individual in the path of his self discovery. The nations will go through that. So, what is the danger? The danger is when a person begins the self discovery, life is very simple. So, the early life of nations is very easy. All is good, all is wonderful, all is hunky dory. But then an individual begins to discover, and as he enters into the deeper aspects of its own being, it may mistake the vital for its soul. It may mistake the ego for the soul, and that's where the challenge lies. So, India is going through this process. Some of the nations have started this process, and it's happening because of, as I said, there are in every game there is somebody who plays the spoil sport, and this spoil sport is actually meant to make the game more and more perfect. So I mean, sorry to say, but I think in modern times the spoil sport is being played by ISIS and the terrorism. So what is doing, it is challenging every way. You speak about equal rights and everything, and he comes and plays the spoil sport. So now you have to find a new way, a better way, a more beautiful way. You can't regress back to that level. So, that better way will be when we understand how human beings are caught up in a net of ignorance, and they can be, recovered from. Shubhinder has spoken about all this, about the future sociology, way too much in the future. He speaks about the spiritualized society, and it'll begin to emerge when human beings realize that not only they are not just the body and the ego self, and instead of focusing only on that, we focus on the spiritual self development, and then there will be a new sociology where we don't treat people as either saints or criminals or units of social problems, but as souls that are either trapped in ignorance or souls that are relatively freed from the bound of ignorance. So we have to begin to educate, reform, and transform. So that's how social transformation will take place. So if we don't do that, so say for instance, now the challenges that many of the nations are facing, as I said, ISIS is playing a spoil sport. It's a bad role to play, the role of the villain in the piece. But villains have their own role. So how do you deal with this villain? So one way is that you hit out and hit back. Now people are trying that. It doesn't work out actually. It's very temporarily, and you have to do it as a temporary measure. The second is help the individual discover who you truly are. So, in the context of Islam, I would say that leave aside the political ideological aspect and help people discover that what is the truth of your own being. It's very difficult, but that is the path that humanity will take. But other is that you blindly accept and subject everybody to a common code. Common code is necessary in a nation building. That part is very clear, that unless we have a common code, an organization. So first is of course the physical body, then you have to have an organization, and the organization can only work through a common code. That has been effectuated in some of the Western countries. In India, it is not, of course, everybody has their own doubly, and everybody has their own music to play. But you have to have a common code, and then after having a common code, you have to allow in this common code should be wide and supple and plastic to allow for the growth of individuals and the individual group life towards their true self. Now, that is a process in the Indian context. I've been watching it very closely, and I can see how it is emerging. So, on one side, there is a greater and greater understanding that there is a very dark side in the Islamic context which has to go, which must go. On the other side, there is a group of, maybe a small group, who are beginning to say that this is not what we are, this is not how and who we are. And when humanity or the human groups begin to reject this false identity, then we will see that a greater and deeper unity will emerge. It is bound to happen. It will happen, unfortunately. as the mother said, through the power of crashing circumstances. So all these crashes are taking place now. The world is so complexly interdependent now that nobody can be in isolation. But it is important for a nation to develop a legitimate pride within its own cultural and its own inner life. So if it doesn't, then there is no formation of a nation. So in India, for example, we are overrun by colonial rule and the Islamic invasions, etc. So we had forgotten who we are. So Shibindo started by reminding us who we are and the spirit of that. And this is what we see happening in India. So each country will bring its own unique contribution. And that contribution will be for all the world. I mean, that's how this, at a most material level, we see it. And that's why everything happening at one place impacts everyone. So this is a very complex process which is taking place. It's very evident in Japan, it's very evident in India, um, to an extent in Russia, America, France, England, Europe. They're trying to rediscover and redefine itself. The two spoil sports, if I may say so, one is, of course, the ISIS, and the second is the Chinese. But Chinese, because way back, it's a great civilization. Like any other Asiatic culture, it has high intellectual, at some point, a very great intellectual upsurge was there. That's why, but what was missing there was the deeper heart. So perhaps that's why the proximity to India was meant for bringing in that deeper heart. Like in America, we see the process of mixture with the African continent and how it brought in that deeper heart and activated it. But perhaps that's what was meant originally, Hindi chini bhai bhai, but it turned into bye bye because again the artificial kind of nature. But they would benefit. There is no doubt about it. If the contact could really take place at a deeper level, it would benefit. But not right now. Right now, it's just playing a spoil sport. So again, what is the solution of all this? Now, China is still trying to redefine its boundaries, meaning thereby it's still in the most elementary state of nation formation where you are not yet sure what the country is. So these boundaries are defined, as I said, geographically. You can't start transgressing it. You can't start, going and claiming places which are across the, let's say, the Himalayan barrier or the ocean and start claiming. But it is trying to do that. It is only when it begins to rediscover its own larger cultural aspects, its intellectual aspect, that it will become a helpful contributor to the world. So the point is, we are speaking of a subject which is way too into the future. Let the nations discover their own soul, each in its own way, before we can talk about their coming together and internationalism. That experiment has been initiated in Aurobindo, which means it is bound to happen. But still into the future. Why this is important is because the focus of each nation right now should be to turn back upon itself, explore its own culture, its own ethos, its own intellectual tendencies, and go deeper and deeper into it, unearth it, sublimate it, refine it, and that is given to each one who, those who are living in a particular nation or belong to a certain country. So this was, when mother was asked, how can I help India? She said, discover your soul and then unite it with the soul of India. And that is the way you can discover what India is and you can help it. So this is the process, and each nation must do that in their own way. Even with America, it has gone all out, trying to go far and wide with the idea of liberty. And so this doesn't work this way. You have to first go within yourself and discover. And how to discover it? The individuals which comprise a nation have to do it. So all the human beings are like the little cells of a nation unit. So how individuals will do it? When there is a larger atmosphere within a country to do that, to discover it. If we take a illegitimate pride in, or even a legitimate pride in, let's say, material power, then we are only aggrandizing the asuric elements. But if you say, well, we have been given abundance, I think that's what the first vision of Washington meant. I mean, it meant that, well, you are being given materially abundant. There's so much of material abundance. But how we really use it, it's a blessing. He said, you must live for God and We know that he was himself a man of God. He used to pray, and that's how he got these visions. That you must live for God, and when you live for God, is not living for a particular religion, but when you live to manifest the divine will in creation, you have been given this abundance, which should be used for the manifesting the will of the divine in this world. So this is how this process is going on, and I would rather like to have questions than continue with it. But it's a very fascinating process to those who want to watch the world play and the forces that govern it, right from the ancient races, how they moved, how the nations changed their boundaries, drifted, and then through the political processes, through empire buildings, through contact of cultures. And now we are entering into that phase where just like individuals are in the phase of discovering the soul. So this experiment upon earth has entered into a very critical phase. So that's why we see now there is so much stress on individuality. Is whether in the west or the east, this is largely a maybe 100 200 years old phenomena, or maybe 100 years old, where there is this need to discover your own individuality. In the west, a rational order of society was overthrown, and we see something happening in India also. So just as we have entered that phase where individuals want to discover who they are, we see that nations are also trying to discover who they are, and this is the next phase of evolution. The third will be where we'll discover ourselves as spiritual being, and each nation will discover its soul, and then we will see the fulfillment of the grand divine plan of unity in diversity. So this is evolution, three-step process. We are in phase 2, and we must focus on that rather than rush to phase 3, because prematurely when we try to attempt something like empires were ways to create world unity, we will end up probably messing up the work. Of course, nature will help us and guide us, and this is the divine pressure pushing towards that. So this is the phase when each individual must discover his own spiritual individuality, and each nation must discover its own true soul, rather than try to extend, because this is not the age for that. That age is over. So any country which is trying to do that, people are often worried about second, third world war. It won't, nature won't support it, because that age when nations were not yet formed, people could form world empires is over. That age is gone. Nature will see to it it's not possible. There are various means and mechanisms, we need not discuss that. Now is the time for each one to discover their own soul, nationally and individually. So this is the basic background. Any particular questions, I'll be happy to take them.
Thank you. Thank you, Alok, very much for this very beautiful and insightful presentation, and especially your conclusions were very pertinent and meaningful. We have several with us panelists, with us Anu, we have Vivek, we had just a minute ago, Baso was through the whole presentation. I would invite them also to speak, to ask the questions, to generate the discussion on this profound and very interesting topic. And maybe I will say a small part from my side, that Aurobindo description of how nations were formed and became aware of themselves. He describes this in the human cycle, that they first build the empires, so to say, they go over their boundaries, so where, over the borders, seeking for themselves, and then falling back to their own, borders where they belong, where then lands belong, where their nations were formed over thousands of years. It's a long period to form the nation on the land. So land plays a special role, and you can see all these big empires from every country, from British Empire, which was taking the whole world, and fell back to their own island, or any one of them. The Frenchies, Germans tried a few times with the Second World War to extend and fell back to their borders. All the empires crumbled down to their own national, and then they don't need any more wars. they're becoming self-aware, and you can see in the European Union there is no need in the border between Germany and France. Nobody will overtake nobody, because they formed their awareness, which is respected by both. And this is something new. It's a new situation where borders are not needed. And of course, some countries try to maintain their empires, like Russian Empire. It's an empire crumbling down. And it will be quite painful for others, but it will find itself finally nationally. Russia is looking for this Russian Republic or Russian spirit or Russian country. It's not that huge land with 22 republics and none of them is Russian. So those republics have to live. They have to also become aware of themselves. It's a necessity, which Aurobindo beautifully describes. And then only that human unity will become possible. As the third step of Vishnu, Aurobindo beautifully also says, 3 steps. First step of Vishnu is family, awareness within the family. The second step, nation, bigger entity, where we are training ourselves to have these soul relations, brotherhood relations. And finally, the human unity becomes possible. So I'm very inspired with these talks, yours and Basu's. Unfortunately, Basu has left. I wanted his reflection upon your talk, but if Anu would like to say, or Vivek, or Radhe, please do before we go into the questions and answers. Yes, Anu, you have to unmute yourself first. It's in the corner, in the left lower corner. You have to click.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to hear you. And I was actually listening to you from the point of view of the next chapter of this session that you have created, Vladimir and Radhe. What you said at one point is that, and this whole question of the nation soul, because that is something which we will look at also with Orwell's International Zone. So when you say, we looked for the nation soul and found the national ego, and that is also one of where a large part of the world got stuck. Also, Vladimir, what you just said about this whole thing about the great states and the great nations and everything, perhaps what we're going through right now is a whole reorganization of the world. And I wonder, Alokra, if you would speak a little bit about that through what you're saying. It really seems where we are right now.
You mean where we are as a group life within a nation, right?
No, as the way the world seems to be in such a place of, let's say, conflict and being out of balance. So many divisions right now, as though it is trying to reorganize itself.
Absolutely true. That's through
the soul. Yeah.
So I look at all these disruptive forces which operate in, and basically there are 2 kinds of forces which operate, and they are very active. Now, one is the forces of a new creation and new constructions, and the other is forces of destruction. So I look at all these disruptive forces as elements which basically are there to make the construction more and more perfect. So it's like you try to do something and it is taken a route and they come and disrupt it. So eventually, of course, it makes us to reflect, makes us, everybody reflect in one way or the other. And though momentarily it looks like the disruptive forces have won over, because it's so easy to demolish something which was being constructed. I mean, how beautiful if humanity could grow without that. That's, of course, an ideal situation where we could just respond with plasticity to the divine will. But it doesn't. So disruptive forces come in and they seem to win because they demolish a building. But ultimately, the forces of new creation are bound to take over because they are taking shape within the heart of humanity. You can, disrupt an outer process, but how do you disrupt an inner process? So there are human beings who are evolving through everything. They are rediscovering themselves, discovering new ways, new methods to through the challenges that these forces pose, and eventually it'll figure out. Now what that process is, one can, for instance, as I said that well, even in the Auroville context, people have often asked, I said you should, it's not about individual systems, ideologies, etc., but it's about the psychic law, the dharma aspect, which should be dharma not as a religion but as the way of life which is more consistent with the spiritual way of looking at things. That's how it should be. Now, if we look at things from a purely mental point of view, then we will not find an answer because, well, the mind cannot provide an answer. This is what Mother and Aurobindo have been telling us. But then humanity will do that. That is the unfortunate part, till it ultimately exhausts all its mental tendencies and falls back or climbs higher towards its higher spiritual vision. So I see all these confusions as inevitable process, because the old world, the mental world, if I may say so, is asserting itself, holding on to itself, its own way. I see this happening even in Europe. When you start, indiscriminately, all kinds of people enter. Now, how do you handle that? Because, it creates another kind of crisis where, there are people who are not aligned to a common, way of life. As, Vladimir was pointing out that Europe discovered many beautiful things, but still the integration of the individual with a very heterogeneous society has not taken place. Now, when that happens, how do you meet that challenge? The people who are completely not at all, not only not aligned, they are going to overrun the entire cultural and, if I may say so, the spiritual ethos. So how do you handle that? This is a challenge which UK is facing, France is facing, many of the European countries are facing. India has been facing this since long. Auroville is facing. So old ways of life, mental ways of understanding and solving a problem, that is gone. This part is very clear, at least to me, but people have to discover it in their own way. For instance, I gave this example of a democratic system. It just doesn't work. How do you make, it's basically, even common sense, how do you make 100 people, all of them agree to one standpoint? So it doesn't work out. So you have to have a common central point. That common central point has to be divine or the spirit in which alone you can unite. Other than that, no, but this cannot be forced upon people. That is the biggest problem. So I suppose the solution lies in awakening mankind first through education, through all this seminars, conferences, to this deeper spiritual self. And I think this is the phase where we should focus right now. Nolly at one point said something very interesting when conflict between Auroville, ashram, society, all this was going on. Not really with ashram, but society. And he was asked that, why not, bring together? He said, no, for some time it is important that each grows in their own way. When we evolve towards the Gnostic being, the unity will come together by itself. So I suppose the stress in every group should be to discover their own spiritual basis of existence, do it through education, through seminars, whatever means are available through us, through collective readings. Satsang is one of the best ways. That has been missing. That is the cause of a lot of confusion. Because that jnana aspect through which we need to relate with the world, that is missing. I have seen this in all the groups. People come, they presume that because they have physically joined a group, therefore they are aware of what the group life stands for. It's not so at all. So now all this is happening to remind us that karma has a meaning when there is jnana, standing behind, and there is love which is motivating and impelling it. So these three must come together. One is love, and that love cannot be born where there is self-interest. So love can only be born when there is love for the deeper vision, the higher truth that is manifesting. And it cannot manifest just by blind karma. If there is no jnana behind it, why we are doing what we are doing, things will end up in chaos. So it's a reminder of our imperfection, that's all. That's how I look at it. It's a process which is going on, much more intense than earlier.
Thank you so much. Yeah. And if somebody else would like to say, Radhe or Vivek.
1 minute.
No, I'm fine. I think we can maybe take a question or two from the audience.
Right. From the audience, should I read them out?
If you want to leave, you can leave again. You have the freedom, okay?
So, Pranam, I seek to ask those countries whose original spirit of existence, civilization, have gotten modified over time, and nations, or rather those nations which have been created under some unpleasant and undesirable circumstances, do they too have a country soul? That means most probably without federations and all those empires which have got stuck, like Russian Empire, for example. Yes, please, this is the question. Do they have a soul, or maybe they are in the process of finding it?
This is a question which has vexed me also. I have tried to look. I'm not sure if, as I said, the desert lands, if I see, it grew up in a certain way. Now, if I look at the origin, so what is called as Semitic, unfortunately, if the story of Shem and who was that person who came towards Asia. So it's very interesting. And the third son who went to Africa. It's a very interesting story. But basically, three sons of Noah. So when I look at that, I feel, at least this is my feeling, that the land of Arabia is not even clear about what it is really seeking, and what it has taken many elements from the entire Semitic culture, which was already existing. I mean, again, I know this term is more or less dated, but from the desert area, the Jews, the Israel, and all that land, and it has not really found anything of itself. So it is a place which has been right from beginning. It's like a disruptive force which has acted. I'm sorry to say that, but if I look at the entire history of Islam, of course, when you disrupt, you assimilate new things, beautiful things. You have your own beautiful creations, but it is a place which is yet to discover who they are as a people. I think the attempt was made by when they touched Kashmir, and Sufism was born as a result of contact between Islam and Indian thought. So Sufism was something very beautiful. It could give a very new color and temperament to the Arabic people, and that would have been very beautiful, because at heart they are very nice. I mean, my interaction with individually with them has been very nice. The Arabic origin people, I'm not talking of Muslims right now. So they're very beautiful, very emotional, very passionate in nature, unlike the Jews who are very intellectual. But perhaps because of the extreme passionate nature, they have not been able to discover who they are, and that's why there is so much of disruption. Now, this is how I see them. About the Chinese, mother has said number of things, and I don't want to repeat that. But I do feel that there is a kind of strange insensitivity about the world at large. It's like a country which is lost within itself, but then because of their beautiful past, uh, they will have to once again get back to that trail of Lao Tse and other. At this point, it doesn't seem, to me at least, in the near future, anything in that direction. But if it doesn't, it has lost the way. I mean, frankly, such a wonderful way. If you look at the old Chinese culture, when they were maybe the invasion by the Mongols that completely took them off the grid. So
Yeah, from the movement,
there are a couple of
yes.
them.
The Chinese were trying to kind of, make it uniformal, so to say. The many
Yeah.
nations within China were destroyed, languages, cultures,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
they
That's
made
true.
it uniformal, and now they kind of succeeded. This question, whether uniformal becomes at the end real, is the question. Yes, Aurobindo has his
Yeah, and very dangerous, very
dangerous.
dangerous, very dangerous.
Aurobindo has his kind of hint in the human cycle about this. He says, if very long time this uniformity is imposed on the nations of different cultures, it may create over time the psychological oneness, psychological affinity, psychological way of understanding each other, and that could become the ground for the emergence of a new formation. Yeah.
I particularly feel it's more like a herd unity, where people are joined by a kind of common way of life, common dangers, common threats, or perceived threats. But I think there is a movement taking place within Chinese context, and I feel this is my very intuitive sense, and maybe over the years it will manifest. It is beginning to implode inside because nature will not allow this kind of, as you said, stability in uniformity. And it is imploding, and when it implodes, there will be a chance for it to really restructure itself. I have a feeling it will happen. I don't know when. Maybe the point is nearer than what we expect, but it's important and necessary for the world. So it's a kind.
What do you think about United States? What is this experiment of
It is.
nature?
It is. It is to keep us very well grounded. It's the experiment at awakening the spiritual consciousness in matter. If you want to put in, that's a country which I think, with a certain degree of familiarity because of my visits, I can say it's a grounding of spirit in matter. Something very beautiful, something very important, but at the same time, it runs the risk of again at some point even standardizing spirituality into a certain forms. So that's how I look at United States. It has to provide the material basis for the spiritual evolution. But so far, as the mother said, it has often gone, because that's how, see, matter is under the strong grip of the inconscient. So it easily lends itself to the asuric, forms, and gives the money to for all the wrong causes. But I don't see it as something which is long in the coming. I feel with the kind of work and energy, spiritual energies that have poured into America, and it has taken it, absorbed it. I have a feeling that it is awakening. It is waking up to its own deeper truth, to its fact of it is like the earthing, grounding spirituality in matter. In one word, that's how I look at it. And once it gets it, because just like with anything, when the body learns, it learns it fully. So I have this feeling that once it gets grounded in the American and doesn't drift into all kinds of fashionable forms that the vital tends to take, then it will be a beautiful asset for the world. And I think that's the process which is going on, and quite reasonably well. Leaving aside, yeah.
Yeah. Well, these are fascinating topics. There is one more question about comments on
Yeah.
Canada, if you can make. Quite complex question. We have a nascent focus on multiculturalism with high levels of immigration. 2 centers of Indian culture, Brampton, outside Toronto, and Vancouver. Both an attraction to the material success of the USA and resistance to its excesses.
Well, I don't have a very direct contact with the Canadian people, but from whatever I have read about the Canadian culture, some of the stories that I have read, I have the impression of a group of humanity which is really speaking like, humanity which is flush with a kind of simple way of looking at life, but a beautiful way of looking at life. So that kind of inherent complexity which is beginning to now enter Canada, because of its simplicity, like all are welcome, all can come, and multiculturalism, as you said, but it has not developed complex inner thought structures to handle it. This is what it is going through, and I'm sure it will be able to handle. But that's the process. A group of, like many of these people coming from the colder places, with Russia, for example, or Sweden, Switzerland, Norway to an extent. I mean, I'm not talking of the Norse gods and others, but a very simple way of looking at life, which is consistent with the origin. When you look at wide expanses of snow, so what happens? See, that's how how your geography influences. You have a religion and a group of humanity developing in a desert land. It has a way of looking at life which is like a monotone, uniform, cut away music, cut away this, that, everything. When you have life thriving in forest and multi variety of land like in India, You have, Rang Barse, Ras Barse, everything, Krishna with plumes, and, you have a variety in every aspect of life, God is entered. And you have mountain areas where life is relatively simple, and, there is that snowy summits, and there are time to time that changes which take place. So it's like people who develop that kind of attitude within life that, let things come, they will thaw out with period of time. But in the present state of the world, you need to have very complex intellectual systems unless you develop a psychic simplicity. That is not there. It is the simplicity of a humanity which is like, you see no evil, you don't know evil, and so you bring in a whole lot of humanity, but evil comes through that door. And then you have to develop ways and means. That's what is happening. That's why many of the statements made by the Canadian Prime Minister, for example, they appeal to a certain sense. But then the challenges that begin to show up. How do you deal with it? Either you develop or discover the psychic simplicity, or you develop the intellectual complexity to deal with these things. And I think it will take that second route. To develop psychic simplicity, it could, maybe its proximity to the northern pole could have happened. I don't know. I don't think that's happening right now. A lot of Indians have gone. There's a real danger, by the way, of the whole country being taken over by subversive forces. And one has to be very careful. Back in India, we feel the repercussions of that. Yeah. I mean, it's good intention. I do appreciate. Yeah.
There is an interesting mentioning by the mother that for the total intellectual development, the two languages are very useful, English and French together.
Yeah.
And she mentions this, and that's why they taught French and English in school.
Absolutely.
So Canada is that kind of combination of both in a way, and has an advantage in some way. So the country is huge in the land and culture and climate, and still they are very highly developed and very democratic in a way. Interesting. There's some interesting things happening in Canada.
Yeah.
It's my guess. There is another question which is very, very interesting. Do you foresee one world government occurring in a positive way with a view towards spiritual values, or will there likely be a darker, control-oriented one world government first?
Okay, so this part is very clear. One world government at this stage will be a disaster. And Shivendra spoke about it in the formation of world state, because if you have, these forces of checks and balances are required in the present state. So one world government is a very, very, very far off into the future, because there is a real risk. It won't be one state which, or one head of a country, nation which governs it. It has to be then a confederation, larger confederation of the world, wherein maybe, some of these countries come together, not because of their economic rating and other things, but they come together, and that's the ultimate, vision of national souls coming together to form a world unity. There would be certain countries which will take the lead. So it will be a confederation of nations which come together and form a world government. It's way off into the future. Right now, it'll be very risky and dangerous. At some point, yes, not right now. It will be like a confederation of nations which come together. Not all of them, but some of them which are like representative, and they must come together for the good of
We see this clearly in EU, yes, formation of EU, how they try to manage common sense interaction, being free at the same time. And once it was too much of the centralized kind of imposition, then the Brexit took place, and England had to leave because it was too much to impose.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's a good example for this danger of centralized.
Yeah, EU is a good example of this. Yeah.
Right. There is one more question. Is there a tipping point of change of consciousness where the collective conscious evolution at a global level will get adequately aligned and take off? Some tipping point.
Well, of course, there will be a tipping. Yeah, yeah, yeah. There will be a tipping point, and I think we are fast moving towards that. Yes, certainly there will be a tipping point. So, tipping point will come essentially if more and more individuals globally in different, that message of the mother that the new world is born in all countries. There are men who feel it, who know it, at least feel it. It is to them we call, will you collaborate? And that future of the earth depends upon a change of consciousness, and the change is bound to come. Now, this tipping point is an inner tipping point, and it is not by the number of individuals who are outwardly professing a spiritual awakening. But this tipping point is coming fast because, despite all this, regardless of all this, behind the scenes, a larger sense of spiritual consciousness is developing in the world. It is happening unseen, like the baby Krishna in the ramparts of Kansa's prison. So it's happening unseen, but it is happening. And that's why we see time to time the cry for world unity, the cry for peace, all this is happening because of that. But when that tipping point will take place, we do not know. Maybe humanity, because of this intense pressure of contrary circumstances, crashing circumstances, will only hasten towards it. So I only hope it is sooner, and maybe 50 years. It's not too far away.
Yeah, it's not too far.
That point comes, then rest will be an easy process.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We are taking too much time of yours and you. It's quite late in India already. So sorry to kind of extend.
No, it's a joy.
It's a joy to listen to these topics, and especially your views, which are very intuitive and very insightful. There's much to think about. So we are very happy for everybody to join us today, and
Thank you, Alok, very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. And I'll have to say, this is, we did our announcements early because we normally people start dropping off after an hour. This is the first time we haven't lost a single person. They have stayed tuned with you. And we even had to, unfortunately, let a couple questions go because it is getting late for you there in India. But we so much appreciate it. And I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you.